My name is Aaron, and I took the job cleaning tents because I needed to stop owing people money. I had been scraping by since I was 17, fixing storefront signs and pressure washing facades for cash, waking up to the sour smell of cheap coffee and the idea that tomorrow there might be one less bill. I packed a dented tin lunchbox and a thin blanket and told myself this was temporary. I did not tell anyone I was leaving. That was my first practical mistake, and maybe my easiest one to forgive. I grew up in a house with a leaky roof, two brothers who learned to be loud so the landlord would not notice us, and a mother who worked nights at a bakery and read me stories in the dark between ovens. I left school early because money called more insistently than any lesson plan. I learned to carry heavy things, to be careful with small talk, and to sleep sitting up on shifts where the lights blinked off at midnight. Those years taught me patience and a trade with my hands, but they also taught me to accept offers that sounded like lifelines. By the time I was 28, my back was a map of old bruises, and my savings were a rumor. I said yes to the first person who promised steady cash. Before the circus, there was a season when I thought I might become steady. I dated a woman named Mara for a year. She knew how to iron a shirt until it looked new, and she worried in a way that felt like a promise. When she left, it was with a suitcase and another man who could pay her rent. After that, I learned how to keep my head down and my expenses lower still. The small job ads that promised food and a roof burned brighter than danger. In between the paragraphs of my life, I learned the worst kind of bargaining. I traded questions for money and answers for work. That pattern brought me to the field where the tents had already been set up before we rolled in. The man who found me wore a coat that stuck out from the dust like a bruise. He walked with a cane and never showed his name. He said he needed someone to clean, to sweep, to empty bins, to be quiet about what they found. He smelled of old tobacco and something sweet like a candy that had been left in sunlight. He offered cash in an envelope, immediate and thick. He introduced himself as Corbin, but everyone called him Ringmaster. His voice was soft and precise. He said we were a family. I nodded. I took the envelope. That was my second mistake. When we arrived, the field seemed to have been waiting. The tents were black and brass, rows of canvas that did not look like they could be folded back into trucks. There were wagons with painted eyes and a trailer with ivy growing out of its seams, though I am certain no plant could have survived the salt in the air. I remember the smell of the place as if it were a second garment. Sugar burned in the cooking tents, the grease of frying pastries layered with the metallic aftertaste of machinery oil, and something wet and mineral that tasted like coins on my tongue. The light at dusk made everything too grainy, as if someone had put a movie filter over real life. Corbin handed me a pin in the shape of an upside-down star and a small envelope with my name written in a hand that did not tremble. He said, "Wear the pin." He said, "Keep the envelope closed." He said, "Follow the rules." He smiled, and that smile made the men who trailed him straighten, as if the world had just been inspected. My first weeks were mostly routine. I swept under trailers where the mice left tiny silver bones. I wiped mirrors that reflected faces I did not yet know. I learned names. Elias was the rigging man who smelled of rope and soap. Marta cooked pies and could tell you the weather by the stickiness on her hands. Jonah was the one who fixed lights and hummed like a distant engine. Clara cleaned the costumes and hummed songs from a childhood I never heard. Tomas drove the supply wagon, and Victor ran the box office, speaking kindly to customers who paid in paper and secrets. Lucinda, who everyone called Madame Lucinda, kept a little trailer that smelled of herbs and lemon oil and sat alone with a kettle and a stack of cloth dolls. Each person had a role, and each person had eyes that watched what you did with the pin and envelope. The money came every morning in folded bills placed under our plates. It was neat and dependable, and soon it felt like rent paid in silence. There were rules. Rule 1 was simple and repeated. Keep the pin visible at all times. Rule 2 was practical. Never wander into another performer tent without permission. Rule 3 was spoken in a whisper and only by those older than me. Do not ask about the locked tent near the back, and never peek into the water tank at night. Corbin said the rules as if lecturing a child and smiling like a man who had rehearsed mercy. The rules made people feel safe. They also kept us small. The night I learned why the tank was kept secret began with a report from Victor. He found something floating near the drain. I was wiping the floor of the cooking tent when Jonah shouted my name. He sounded like someone in the middle of a cough who could not stop laughing. I ran. He was standing near the tank tent, the canvas billowing like a throat. The zipper had been left partly. I remember the cold that slid between my ribs when I saw the water. It was the color of old mirrors, a green that ate light. There was movement beneath the surface like someone turning in sleep. My tongue had that metallic penny taste again. The dialogue that night was a slow unwinding of calm into alarm. Jonah said you should not look long. I said why? He said because their singing is a lie. I asked who? He said people you do not want to believe. Corbin appeared, and his voice was quiet. He said, go away. I said, tell me what is in the water. He laughed softly and said, everything and nothing. Lucinda came then and placed a hand on my shoulder. She said, keep your hands busy. I said, what do you mean? She said, some jobs are cleaning and some jobs are swallowing. I asked her if she meant that literally. She said she meant that it is easy to forget how hungry people can be. The conversation ended with Corbin closing the zipper and the canvas beating against his back like a heart. There were at least 10 exchanges, each one a tightening knot. What I saw through the seam the next day cannot be untasted in memory. The tank was large and its glass was pocked with salt. When I peered, there were shapes beneath, elegant curves and slow folded arms, and faces that looked like porcelain dolls left in sun too long. They were beautiful in a way that hurt. Their skin was pale and luminescent, and their hair floated like threads of ink. One of them looked directly at me, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. Then I saw bone, a glint along the jaw that did not belong to beauty. I found a rib half buried in the silt near the drain, and its surface was varnished like a museum piece. The smell near the tank was different from the field. It was cold and smelled of deep water and rust and the faint hint of roses. I touched the glass and felt it vibrate with a low sound like someone humming far away. I tasted copper. I confronted Corbin in his office trailer, and the conversation stretched long. He spoke like a man explaining a ledger. He told me the entertainers were not what they seemed. He told me they were rare and requiring. He said the audience paid to see rare things, and that the price of keeping them was steep. I asked how steep. He said people will trade their limbs in markets of hunger. I asked what we traded. He said we collected what others left behind. I asked if that included people. He said sometimes. He asked me if I was still willing to sweep and clean for the price we had agreed. I asked if there was choice. He said there was always choice if you wanted to pay another price. The exchange had more than a dozen turns, each reply a thin coat over the next truth. Around us, the trailer smelled of lemon oil and old money. That night, Lucinda came to me and she did not speak in riddles. She brewed tea and set 2 cups on a low table. Her kettle sang, a small comforting noise. She told me she had been with traveling shows for 20 years and had seen kindness folded into cruelty so many times that it had become a pattern. She said the creatures in the tank were kept because they drew crowds, and that every audience paid with a kind of hunger. She said there were rules that were not on paper but were enforced all the same. I asked if there was a way out. She touched my knuckles and said quietly that there is always a way out, but it costs. I asked, cost of what? She closed her eyes and said, time, memory, sometimes a piece of yourself you cannot find again. Her voice was calm as river stones. The exchange was intimate and had 6 or 7 small movements of speech and silence that felt like counting breaths. Tension came to a head when Elias and Marta tried to smuggle a performer out. They worked the ropes together, whispering in the rigging room. I overheard them because I had been sweeping where the boards meet, and the sound of their voices carried like a melody I was not meant to hear. The conversation was hurried and fearful. Elias said, "The crate is ready." Marta said, "The children will hear." Elias said, "The route is clear." Marta said, "Will Corbin notice?" Elias said, "Corbin notices everything." Marta said, "Then we move tonight." Elias said, "We cannot leave Clara." Marta said, "Clara is safe." That exchange was quick and clipped and came with the metallic scent of adrenaline. At dusk, they moved. They misjudged the timing. The rope slipped and the crate dropped with a horrible sound, as if the world had dropped a plate. The tank heard it. I will not describe everything that night, because some things are better kept as a warning. I will say that when the tank heard the crate, it answered in ways I did not expect. The water rose against the glass like a tide called by a bell. There were screams, and the smell of salt was everywhere. Corbin came out, and his face was quiet like a ledger being closed. He spoke softly, and then he spoke to the crowd, and the crowd cheered because they had been sold a spectacle. The performers we thought we could hide became part of an arrangement we had not understood. The conversation that followed between Corbin and the crew was long and legal in tone, but thin in mercy. He said rules had been broken and that the price must be paid. He listed fines and obligations as if he were reading out household bills. Each item was a sentence removed from a knife. My escape was not a single cinematic moment. It happened by inches and by small mercies. I packed the tin lunchbox again and folded my blanket. I waited until the middle of the night when the tents all sighed and the field breathed like some great sleeping animal. I slipped past the trailer where Victor kept the tills, and I took a small stack of bills left for change from the plate of someone who had not noticed. I did not steal for sport. I stole to make distance. I walked the road until my feet felt bloodless and my hands began to remember the shape of normal life. I left a note for Lucinda that said thank you, and I put it under her kettle. She read it and she nodded without looking surprised. Her eyes were old and soft. 1 month after I left, I was in a small apartment above a laundromat. The place was noisy and thin-walled and had a smell of soap that was gentle. I had 2 part-time jobs, one washing windows and one reattaching signs for a bakery. I paid my debts and started a ledger with a pencil. The nights were quiet, and I had no dream of sugar burnt on my tongue. I wrote letters I did not send, and I kept the pin in a drawer as a cautionary ornament. The money bought stability, and I learned the cost of that stability was an ache that woke me sometimes. I wrote to Lucinda once, and her reply came on thin paper. She said she had seen the tide, and that sometimes the water takes what it wants. She told me to learn scent again and to hold close to small things like light bulbs and soup. 3 months later, I found a photograph in a newspaper clipping shoved into a book at the library. It showed a tent with black and brass canvas and a small headline about a missing performer. I traced the edges of the photo with my thumb and felt a cold that was not outside. I called Mara and we talked for an hour. We did not talk about the circus. We talked about a recipe she was trying to perfect. Those were ordinary things that felt like skin mended. I started to volunteer on Sundays at a community kitchen. The hands I met there belonged to people whose hunger was honest. They nodded at me when I returned a bowl or wiped a table. The ledger I kept showed that I had not become a hero. I had not paid everyone back. I had still lost pieces of myself. But the pieces I had recovered were stitched into a life that did not hum with performance. 6 months on, I stood at a field edge and watched a traveling carnival pass in the distance. The tents were smaller, less ornate, and the lights looked tired. I had not returned to the circus, and I would not. The pin was gone, burned in a small ritual in the sink when I willed the thing to stop meaning anything to me. The envelope Corbin had given me I kept folded in a book. Inside was a slip with rules printed in a font meant to look like handwriting, and in the corner a clause that admitted a fine print about ownership of performers and obligations of caretakers. I smiled at the legal language and felt the old ledger close. Lucinda sent me a small doll with a stitched mouth and a note that read, "Keep yours closed when you need to breathe." I kept that doll on a shelf, and I slept without the metal taste in my mouth. If you are watching this and thinking of a life that is just barely holding you, listen to the simple thing I learned and they taught as rules. Rule 1 is real. Keep an eye on the pin you are given and on who pins it to your lapel. Rule 2 is the hardest. If something is kept behind locked canvas and a water tank, do not go near it thinking beauty will save you. Rule 3 is a mercy. If someone offers you money for silence, read the paper they hand you and imagine the ledger in their eyes. I tell this as a confession and as a warning. I tell it as someone who swept the floors of a place that sold wonder and accepted debt in return. I left with a tin lunchbox and a thin blanket, and I came back to an ordinary life that was sometimes sublime. If this story made you feel uneasy, that unease is doing what it should. Tell someone. Share a bit of this with a friend who might be tempted by easy money and a promise of family. Subscribe to the channel if you want more confessions like this. I will keep telling them because some stories can save someone from a smaller waiting room of ruin. Some places promise family. Some places are made to eat the lonely.